The old worn armchair in the corner of the living room had become something of a sanctuary for Helen. It was where the day began with a cup of coffee before the world awoke, and where it ended with a book long after her daughter Beatrice had gone to sleep. From that chair, she could see the whole of their small, cozy apartment, the photos on the mantelpiece, Beatrice's art projects taped to the refrigerator, the scuffed wooden floor that she'd polished just last weekend. Each object was a testament to the life she had painstakingly built, a life for two. Their mornings were a gentle, practiced rhythm. Helen would wake first, the soft light of dawn barely creeping through the blinds. She'd move through the quiet apartment, her steps light, preparing a small breakfast. The smell of toast and coffee would usually be what stirred Beatrice from her dreams. At 16, Beatrice was a whirlwind of teenage energy, but in the mornings, she was soft and sleepy, her long brown hair a tangled mess. She would stumble into the kitchen, wrap her arms around Helen's waist from behind, and mumble, "Morning, Mom." That simple greeting was the fuel for Helen's entire day. It was the reminder that this little world of theirs, was real, and it was hers. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when this home had echoed with the heavier footsteps of a man, with arguments that bounced off the walls and silences that were even louder. Mark, her ex-husband, had been a storm that had passed through her life, and now, 5 years later, she was still nurturing the new growth that had emerged in the calm after he left. He was a man who measured life in transactions. Love was a negotiation, affection was a reward for compliance, and family was an asset to be managed. When he'd walked out, he'd done so with the clinical detachment of a businessman closing a failed venture. He'd told her she was too emotional, too invested in things that didn't have a clear return. He was talking about things like baking cookies on a rainy day, spending hours helping Beatrice with a school project, or simply sitting together and talking about nothing at all. He didn't see the value in connection, only in currency. Helen, on the other hand, had built her entire world on that unseen value. She worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, a job that demanded creativity and discipline, often late into the night after Beatrice was asleep. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills. More importantly, it allowed her to be there. She was there to pick Beatrice up from school, to help with homework, to listen to the endless dramatic sagas of high school friendships. She was the constant, the anchor in Beatrice's life, and she knew her daughter felt it. Their bond was palpable. They shared inside jokes that made them burst into laughter in the middle of a quiet grocery store. They had a weekly movie night, complete with a mountain of popcorn and a fierce debate over which film to watch. Beatrice, with her sharp wit and an empathetic heart that mirrored her mother's, was not just her daughter. She was her friend, her confidant, her partner in this quiet, happy life they had created from the wreckage of their old one. Helen looked at her daughter and saw a universe of potential, a kind and brilliant young woman who was growing up with a deep understanding of love, not as a transaction, but as an unwavering presence. That, Helen thought, was a fortune no bank could ever hold. The life she provided wasn't one of luxury. There were no exotic vacations or designer clothes. Their budget was tight, a carefully balanced equation of income and expenses that Helen managed with meticulous care. Every dollar was accounted for, from the rent to the groceries to the small fund she was diligently building for Beatrice's college education. It was this fund, this dream for her daughter's future, that occupied a special place in her heart. It was the physical manifestation of her love and sacrifice, a quiet promise she was making to her daughter every time she transferred a small amount into the savings account, an account that, for legacy reasons from their marriage, still bore both her and Mark's names, though only she ever contributed to it. She was the one building the future, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. The weekend visits to her father's were a necessary disruption to their peaceful routine. Beatrice never seemed overly excited about them, but she went without complaint. Helen suspected it was more out of a sense of duty than genuine desire. Mark lived in a sleek, minimalist apartment on the other side of the city, a place that felt more like a showroom than a home. It was a reflection of the man himself, clean, orderly, and devoid of any real warmth. Beatrice would return on Sunday evenings, often quiet and contemplative, as if she needed to decompress from the sterile atmosphere of her father's world and readjust to the familiar comfort of her own. But this Sunday was different. When Helen opened the door, Beatrice walked past her without the usual hug. Her shoulders were slumped, and a shadow seemed to hang over her face, extinguishing the usual light in her eyes. She dropped her backpack by the door and went straight to her room, closing the door with a soft but definitive click. Helen's heart immediately sank. She knew that silence. It was the sound of a hurt she couldn't see. She gave Beatrice some space, busying herself with preparing a simple dinner. She made her daughter's favorite pasta, hoping the familiar aroma would be a gentle invitation to talk. An hour later, she knocked softly on Beatrice's door. "Bea, dinner's ready." The door opened, and Beatrice emerged, her eyes slightly red. They sat at their small dining table, the silence between them thick and heavy. Helen waited, not wanting to push, knowing that Beatrice would speak when she was ready. After a few minutes of mechanically pushing pasta around her plate, Beatrice finally looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad said something." Helen put her fork down, giving her daughter her full, undivided attention. "Okay, what did he say?" Beatrice took a shaky breath, her gaze dropping back to her plate. "We were talking about college. I was telling him about the design program I'm excited about, and he was being his usual self. He said it was a frivolous career path. Then he said I needed to think about my future more seriously, and that I couldn't rely on him to fund a hobby." She paused, the next words catching in her throat. "I told him you were already saving up for me, that we had a plan." Helen's stomach tightened. She knew where this was going. Mark's bitterness about her impractical life choices had always been a source of tension. "He just laughed," Beatrice continued, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He said, 'Your mother? Don't be naive, Bea. Her name is on the account, but that's just a formality from the divorce. She doesn't have the means. Her job is to make sure you're fed and dressed. She's just the babysitter." The words hit Helen like a physical blow. Just a babysitter. The phrase echoed in the quiet of the apartment. A cruel and deliberate missile designed to obliterate her value, her sacrifice, her identity. It wasn't just an insult. It was a denial of her entire existence. Every late night she'd worked, every bill she'd struggled to pay, every time she'd put Beatrice's needs before her own. All of it, dismissed in a single, contemptuous phrase. She felt the blood drain from her face, a cold fury mixing with a profound, aching sadness. But it was the look on her daughter's face that shattered her heart the most. It wasn't just sadness in Beatrice's eyes. It was a reflection of Helen's own pain. Beatrice was hurt not for herself, but for her mother. She had seen the injustice, the casual cruelty of her father's words, and it had wounded her deeply. Helen reached across the table and took Beatrice's hand. It was trembling. She squeezed it gently, her own voice surprisingly steady when she finally spoke. "He's wrong, Bea. You know he's wrong." "Of course I know he's wrong." Beatrice's voice cracked with indignation. "I told him he was a jerk. I told him he had no idea what you do for me. For us. But he just smiled that smug smile. Like he knows everything about money and that's all that matters. He made it sound like your love doesn't count. Like it's not real because it doesn't have a price tag." In that moment, Helen saw the fire in her daughter, the fierce loyalty and the clear-eyed understanding of what truly mattered. The hurt was still there, a sharp sting in her chest, but it was now overshadowed by a wave of immense pride. Mark, with all his money and his cold, hard logic, had failed. He had failed to instill his transactional view of the world in his own daughter. Beatrice understood true wealth, and it had nothing to do with the numbers in a bank account. It had to do with the unwavering presence of the person sitting across from her, holding her hand in the quiet of their small, love-filled home. The anger was still there, a simmering coal, but Helen knew she had to be the calm for her daughter. The real victory wasn't in fighting Mark. It was in the resilience of the bond he had tried, and failed, to devalue. Dinner ended, but the chill from Mark's words lingered in the air. Helen tried to restore their evening ritual, suggesting a movie, but Beatrice just shook her head, the fire in her eyes now a low, simmering ember. She retreated to her room again, and Helen was left in the living room, the worn armchair feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a witness box. The accusation, just a babysitter, played on a loop in her mind. It was a poisoned dart, and even though she knew it was untrue, the venom was spreading, making her question every sacrifice, every choice. Was she a fool for believing that love and dedication were enough? Sleep did not come easily to either of them that night. Helen tossed and turned, while in the next room, Beatrice lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her father's smug, dismissive face burned into her memory. It wasn't just the insult that kept her awake. It was the powerlessness she had felt in that moment. Her words of defense had bounced off him, meaningless. He lived in a world of numbers, of proof, of black and white. And in that moment, a quiet, resolute idea began to form in her mind. If proof was the only language her father understood, then she would give him proof. She thought of the college fund. Her mother had spoken of it with such pride, a quiet achievement that belonged only to them. She remembered Helen sitting at the small desk in her bedroom, poring over documents, her brow furrowed in concentration. The important papers, Helen had once told her, were kept in an old cedar-lined wooden box on the top shelf of her closet. Quietly, so as not to wake her mother, Beatrice slipped out of bed. The apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of a street lamp outside the window. She tiptoed into Helen's room. Her mother was asleep, but her rest was fitful, a slight frown creasing her brow. Seeing her like that, so vulnerable, solidified Beatrice's resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about honor. She reached up and carefully pulled the wooden box down from the shelf. It smelled of cedar and old paper, the scent of her mother's quiet diligence. Inside, everything was perfectly organized. Birth certificates, passports, and a series of manila folders. One was labeled, Beatrice College Fund. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were the bank statements, stretching back for years. She pulled out the most recent one. Her eyes scanned the top of the page. Account holders, Mark T. Evans, Helen R. Evans. His name was there, just as he'd said, a legal ghost haunting the account. But then her eyes moved down to the transaction history. It was a long list of deposits. $150, $200, $125. The descriptions were all the same. Online transfer from H.R. Evans Designs. Page after page, it was a chronicle of her mother's hard work. A steady, relentless stream of contributions, small and large, week after week, month after month. The balance, once modest, had grown into a substantial sum, a testament to thousands of hours of work, of late nights and skipped luxuries. Beatrice flipped through the pages, her heart pounding. She looked for a single deposit from Mark T. Evans. There was nothing, not 1 cent. His name was on the account, but his contribution was zero. The account was not a relic of their marriage. It was a monument to her mother's love. The proof. It was right here, in black and white. With a newfound clarity, Beatrice took out her phone. The screen's light felt harsh in the darkened room. She opened the scanning app and carefully captured a high-resolution image of the first page of the statement, the page that showed the account holders' names, the impressive final balance, and the long, damning list of her mother's deposits. She opened her email, her fingers flying across the keypad. She typed her father's email address into the recipient field. For the subject line, she wrote simply, "Something you should see." She attached the image of the bank statement. For a moment, she considered writing a long, angry message, pouring out all her frustration and hurt, but she knew it would be pointless. The numbers would say more than she ever could. They were cold, hard, and undeniable. They were his language. So she wrote only one sentence in the body of the email. "You said Mom's name was just a formality." Her thumb hovered over the send button. This was a point of no return. It might unleash a new storm, another wave of anger from her father. But she didn't care. The truth needed to be seen. She pressed send. The email vanished into the digital ether, a silent missile of truth aimed directly at the heart of his arrogance. She put the statement back in the box, placed it carefully back on the shelf, and walked out of the room. Helen was now sitting in the armchair, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the darkened city outside the window. She looked up as Beatrice entered. "I couldn't sleep," Helen said, her voice heavy. "Me neither," Beatrice replied, her own voice steady. She walked over and knelt before the armchair, taking her mother's hands in her own. "Mom, I did something." She explained it all, finding the box, seeing the statement, sending the email. As she spoke, she watched her mother's face carefully, bracing for any reaction. Helen listened, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, and then to something else entirely. It wasn't anger. It was a slow, dawning sense of release. The lines of sadness around her eyes seemed to soften. A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, but this one was different. It wasn't a tear of pain, but of catharsis. When Beatrice finished, Helen was silent for a long moment. Then she pulled her daughter into a fierce, tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered into Beatrice's hair. And in that embrace, the power of Mark's words finally dissolved. He had not defined them. He had not broken them. His insult, meant to isolate and diminish, had instead forged an even stronger, more unbreakable bond between a mother and her daughter. They were not a transaction. They were a team. The hours that followed felt strangely serene. The storm had broken, not with a loud crash of thunder, but with a quiet, decisive click of a send button. There was no immediate, explosive response from Mark. The night wasn't shattered by an angry phone call. The next morning, there were no furious text messages lighting up their phones. There was only a profound, deafening silence from his side of the city. At first, Helen felt a knot of anxiety. She braced herself for the inevitable backlash. Mark was a man whose pride was easily wounded, and this was more than a wound. It was a direct amputation of his narrative. He had been so effortlessly stripped of his power, not through an emotional outburst he could dismiss, but through the very thing he respected. A document, a number, a fact. As the day wore on, however, her anxiety began to morph into something else entirely. It was a slow-burning ember of realization. The silence wasn't the calm before another storm. It was the response. His lack of a reply was more damning than any angry words could have been. It was the silence of a man who had been confronted with irrefutable evidence of his own insignificance in the life he claimed to judge. He had no defense. There was no comeback, no witty retort, no way to spin the numbers on that page. The statement was a mirror, and it had shown him a truth he couldn't argue with. His name was just a ghost, a hollow echo on an account built by the tireless efforts of the woman he had dismissed. He was the formality, not her. That evening, as Helen sat in her armchair, she felt a weight she hadn't even been fully conscious of carrying finally lift from her shoulders. For 5 years she had lived with the ghost of his judgment. She had built her life in defiance of his parting words, his condescending sighs, his belief that she would fail without him. She had told herself that his opinion didn't matter, yet a small, insidious part of her had always been trying to prove him wrong, if only to herself. She looked over at Beatrice, who was sketching in a notebook at the dining table, a small, peaceful smile on her face. And Helen understood. The proof hadn't really been for Mark. He would likely never admit his error, never apologize, never change. He would simply retreat, his arrogance punctured, and find another way to rationalize his worldview. No, the proof had been for them. It was a validation for Beatrice, confirming what her heart already knew, that her mother's love was a tangible, powerful force. And it was a liberation for Helen. It was the final, definitive severing of the emotional hold he had on her. His judgment was irrelevant because it was based on a foundation of lies. The next morning, their rhythm was the same, but the music had changed. The air felt lighter. As Helen made breakfast, she hummed a tune she hadn't thought of in years. When Beatrice came into the kitchen and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, the hug felt different. It was imbued with a new layer of solidarity, of shared victory. They were allies who had faced a dragon and won, not by slaying it, but by simply showing it its own reflection. Weeks passed. Mark did not call. His next scheduled visit with Beatrice was quietly canceled via a terse text message citing a work conflict. Beatrice simply replied, "Okay," and felt nothing but relief. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered. He could no longer stand on the pedestal of financial authority from which he had looked down on them for so long. One afternoon, Helen found herself sitting in the armchair, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window. The account statement was back in its box, but its message was now etched into the very fabric of their home. Her gaze drifted over the room, the photos, the artwork on the fridge. These weren't just objects. They were artifacts of a life built on something far more precious than money. They were built on time, on patience, on scraped knees and bedtime stories, on late-night work sessions and early morning hugs. They were built on love. She realized that the term babysitter was, in a way, the highest compliment he could have accidentally paid her. What is a babysitter, if not someone who sits with a child, who keeps them safe, who tends to their needs? She had done all that, and so much more. She had not just sat with her child. She had walked with her, grown with her, built a world for her. Her name on that bank statement wasn't just a formality. It was her signature on a masterpiece, the beautiful, resilient, and brilliant life of her daughter. And that was a truth no man could ever diminish. Sometimes the world tries to measure our worth with the wrong tools. It uses spreadsheets and bank statements, job titles, and public recognition. But true value is often quieter. It's found in the steady, unseen actions of love, in the sacrifices made in the dark when no one is watching, and in the courage to build a life on a foundation of kindness and integrity. It is the silent, unwavering presence that tells a child they are loved, not for what they will become, but for who they are, right now. If this story of quiet strength and a mother's fierce love resonated with you, consider subscribing and joining our community. There are countless stories of hidden heroes all around us, and together we can continue to find and share them.